When Jacqueline Reynolds walked into that courtroom, nobody took her seriously. Not the expensive lawyer in his tailored suit. Not her wealthy landlord trying to kick her out of her home. And especially not Judge Maxwell, who actually laughed when she tried to speak. They all thought this high school history teacher would be an easy win. They were wrong. What nobody knew was that Jacqueline had spent weeks preparing her case. She had studied law books, gathered evidence, and discovered something that would turn the entire case upside down. By the time she was finished, even the judge who had laughed at her would be forced to admit something extraordinary. Jacqueline Reynolds was a legal genius. Jacqueline Reynolds took a deep breath as she walked through the big wooden doors of the courthouse. Her hands shook a little as she clutched her folder of papers. She had spent weeks getting ready for this day. Even though her stomach felt like it had butterflies, she stood up straight and tried to look brave. Room 302. Room 302, she whispered to herself, looking at the signs on the wall. Jacqueline was a high school history teacher, not a lawyer. But here she was, about to fight her own case in court. When she found the right courtroom, Jacqueline paused outside the door. Through the small window, she could see her landlord, Mr. Wilson, sitting at one of the tables. Next to him was his lawyer in an expensive suit. They were laughing about something. Jacqueline looked down at her simple blue dress and wished for a moment that she had someone on her side too. No, she told herself firmly. I can do this. Jacqueline pushed open the door and walked in. A few people sat in the back rows, waiting for their own cases. Mr. Wilson and his lawyer didn't even look up when she entered. Jacqueline found the other table and carefully laid out her papers, just like she had practiced at home. A door at the front opened, and a man's voice called out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Robert Maxwell." Everyone stood up as the judge walked in. He was tall with gray hair and glasses. He wore a black robe and had a serious look on his face. Judge Maxwell sat down and put on his reading glasses. First case, Wilson Properties versus Jacqueline Reynolds, eviction hearing, announced the court clerk. Judge Maxwell looked down at his papers. Mr. Wilson is seeking to evict Ms. Reynolds for property damage and late payments. Is that correct? Mr. Wilson's lawyer stood up. Yes, Your Honor. I'm Thomas Reed, representing Wilson Properties. The judge nodded and smiled slightly at the lawyer. Then he turned to Jacqueline with a different look on his face, like he was already tired of dealing with her. And Ms. Reynolds? You're representing yourself? Jacqueline stood up, her heart beating fast. Yes, Your Honor, I am. Judge Maxwell sighed. Very well. Mr. Reed, please present your case. The lawyer walked to the front of the room with smooth, confident steps. Your Honor, my client has been more than patient with Ms. Reynolds. She has repeatedly violated her lease agreement by damaging property and paying her rent late. We have photos of the damage and records of her payment history. He showed some pictures on a big screen. They showed water damage on a ceiling and some broken tiles in a bathroom. Furthermore, the lawyer continued, Ms. Reynolds has been hostile when approached about these issues. My client has no choice but to seek eviction. Judge Maxwell nodded, along as if everything the lawyer said made perfect sense. When Mr. Reed finished and sat down, the judge turned to Jacqueline. Ms. Reynolds, your response? Jacqueline stood up, trying to remember everything she had practiced. Your Honor, I would like to address each of Mr. Wilson's claims. First, regarding the property damage. Speak up, Ms. Reynolds, Judge Maxwell interrupted. And please get to the point. The court has many cases today. Jacqueline nodded and tried again, louder this time. The damage shown in these photos was already there when I moved in. In fact, I've made multiple requests for repairs that were never addressed. According to Section 8.4 of the State Housing Code, landlords must maintain. Judge Maxwell suddenly laughed, cutting her off mid-sentence. A few people in the courtroom chuckled too. "Ms. Reynolds," the judge said, with an amused smile, "this isn't a TV show where you can just memorize a few legal terms and win your case. Real courts need real legal arguments." Jacqueline felt her face grow hot. The laughter felt like needles on her skin. Mr. Wilson and his lawyer exchanged smug looks, but something inside Jacqueline wouldn't let her back down. "Your Honor," she said firmly, "I may not be a lawyer, but I know my rights as a tenant, and I've brought evidence to support my claims." She held up a thick folder of papers. Judge Maxwell looked surprised for a moment, then sighed again. "Proceed, Ms. Reynolds, but please be brief." Jacqueline pulled out her first piece of evidence, a maintenance request form with Mr. Wilson's signature. "This is my first repair request from 8 months ago, specifically mentioning the ceiling damage. I have 5 more requests that were never addressed." She then showed her own photos, dated earlier than Mr. Wilson's. "These show the same damage from when I first moved in." Judge Maxwell's expression changed slightly. He leaned forward to look at the dates on the photos. "As for the late payment claim," Jacqueline continued, "I have bank records showing that all my rent was paid on time." She pulled out more papers. "The lease agreement states rent is due by the 5th of each month. Every payment I made was before that date." Mr. Wilson whispered something to his lawyer, who quickly stood up. "Your Honor, we weren't aware Ms. Reynolds would have this documentation. We may need to review it." Judge Maxwell looked at Jacqueline with new interest. "It seems Ms. Reynolds has come prepared after all." He still didn't sound completely convinced, but he wasn't laughing anymore. "Your Honor," Jacqueline said, gaining confidence, "I'd also like to point out that under State Code 42(3), a landlord must provide written notice of complaints before filing for eviction. I never received any written warnings about these supposed issues." Now Judge Maxwell raised his eyebrows. He looked at Mr. Wilson and his lawyer. "Is this true? Was proper notice given?" The lawyer shuffled through his papers nervously. We believe verbal notices were provided, Your Honor." "The law requires written notice, Counselor, as Ms. Reynolds correctly pointed out," Judge Maxwell said. Jacqueline could hardly believe it. The judge was actually listening to her now. "Additionally," Jacqueline continued, "I have witnesses who can testify about the condition of my apartment and Mr. Wilson's refusal to make repairs. They're waiting outside if the court would like to hear from them." Judge Maxwell sat back in his chair, studying Jacqueline with a puzzled expression. This clearly wasn't going the way he expected. The courtroom had gone very quiet. "Ms. Reynolds," he finally asked, "where exactly did you learn about housing law?" Jacqueline stood tall. "I've been studying at the public library every night after work, Your Honor. When something is important enough, you make the time to learn what you need to know." For a moment, respect flashed across Judge Maxwell's face. But then he quickly returned to his professional expression. "We'll take a 15-minute recess," he announced. "When we return, I want to see all of Ms. Reynolds' evidence and documentation." As everyone stood when the judge left, Jacqueline caught Mr. Wilson glaring at her. His lawyer was whispering urgently in his ear. Jacqueline sat down, her legs suddenly feeling weak. She had gotten through the first part, but this was just the beginning. What no one in the courtroom knew was that Jacqueline had barely shown them anything yet. Her real evidence, her secret weapon, was still waiting in her folder. And once she revealed it, this case would change in ways that even Judge Maxwell couldn't imagine. After the judge called for a recess, Jacqueline hurried out of the courtroom. She needed a moment alone. Finding a quiet corner near a water fountain, she leaned against the wall and took several deep breaths. Her heart was still racing, but now with excitement rather than fear. She had stood her ground against Judge Maxwell's laughter. That was something her grandmother would have been proud of. "You did good in there," came a voice. Jacqueline looked up to see an older woman with kind eyes watching her. "Don't let them intimidate you, honey." "Thank you," Jacqueline replied with a small smile. The woman nodded and continued down the hallway. Jacqueline checked her watch. 10 more minutes before she had to go back in. Her mind drifted to the leaky apartment waiting for her after this. Was all over. If she still had an apartment to go back to. The ceiling in Jacqueline's living room had a large water stain that spread like a brown flower whenever it rained. She had placed buckets strategically around the room during the last storm. In the bathroom, the tiles were cracked and coming loose, and the kitchen sink leaked so badly that she kept a towel underneath it at all times. Jacqueline had been living there for 3 years. It wasn't perfect, but it was home. The rent was just manageable on her teacher's salary. Plus, it was only a 15-minute walk to Lincoln High School, where she taught history to teenagers, who reminded her of herself at that age, full of questions about how the world worked and why things were the way they were. The day she received the eviction notice had been like any other Tuesday. She had just finished grading papers at her small kitchen table when she heard a knock. A man she didn't recognize handed her an envelope without a word and walked away. Inside was the notice giving her 30 days to move out. The reasons listed were property damage and payment violations, both completely untrue. Jacqueline called Mr. Wilson immediately, but he didn't answer. When she went to his office the next day, his secretary said he was unavailable indefinitely for tenants from her building. That night, Jacqueline couldn't sleep. She lived paycheck to paycheck and didn't have money saved for a security deposit on a new place. She also knew that an eviction on her record would make it nearly impossible to find another apartment. The next morning, while her students were taking a test, Jacqueline researched tenant rights on her phone. What she found gave her hope. There were laws protecting renters from unfair evictions. That evening, she went straight to the public library after school. Jacqueline's apartment was on the 3rd floor of a brick building that had been nice once, maybe 50 years ago. All 12 units in the building had received the same eviction notice on the same day. Most of her neighbors had already started packing. "You can't fight a rich man like Wilson," Mrs. Garcia from apartment 3B had said, sadly boxing up her family photos. "We're just little people to him." But Jacqueline couldn't accept that. Her grandmother had raised her to believe that standing up for what's right matters, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Jacqueline's parents had died in a car accident when she was 10 years old. Her grandmother, Eleanor Reynolds, took her in without hesitation. Grandma Eleanor had worked as a secretary for most of her life. Jacqueline didn't know where exactly, just that it involved important papers and busy men in suits. What she did know was that her grandmother was the wisest person she'd ever met. "Education is the one thing no one can take from you," Grandma Eleanor would say while helping Jacqueline with homework at the kitchen table. "Learn everything you can about everything you can." When Grandma Eleanor passed away 2 years ago, Jacqueline inherited her small collection of books and an old wooden chest filled with papers. She hadn't gone through most of it yet. It hurt too much to see her grandmother's handwriting. The chest sat in Jacqueline's bedroom closet, untouched, except for the few times she'd opened it to look for family photos. The night after receiving the eviction notice, Jacqueline's best friend Tasha came over with takeout Chinese food and practical advice. "Just move, Jacqueline," Tasha said, opening a fortune cookie. "This place is falling apart anyway. Why fight it?" Jacqueline poked at her noodles with chopsticks. "It's not just about me. It's about Mrs. Garcia and her kids. It's about Mr. Lee, who's lived here for 20 years. It's about what's right." Tasha rolled her eyes. "You can't save everyone. You're a history teacher, not a lawyer." "Maybe I don't need to be a lawyer," Jacqueline said quietly. "Maybe I just need to know enough law to stand up for myself." Tasha looked doubtful. "You can't beat rich people in court. They have real lawyers with fancy degrees. What do you have?" Jacqueline didn't have an answer that night. But the next day, she started going to the library every evening after work. She checked out books on tenant rights and property law. She took careful notes in a spiral notebook, just like she taught her students to do. She looked up words she didn't understand and wrote down their definitions. After a week, Jacqueline discovered something interesting. Her eviction notice had several technical errors. According to state law, these mistakes could invalidate the entire process. She felt a spark of hope. 2 weeks in, she learned about implied warranty of habitability and realized Mr. Wilson had violated it by ignoring her repair requests. Another point in her favor. By the 3rd week, Jacqueline had filled 3 notebooks with notes. She had printed copies of relevant laws and highlighted important sections. She had organized all her maintenance requests, rent payment receipts, and photos of her apartment's problems into a folder. She was ready to fight. The day before her court date, Jacqueline received a surprise visitor, Tasha, with an apologetic smile and a professional-looking outfit on a hanger. "You'll need to look the part tomorrow," Tasha said, handing over the simple blue dress. "And I'm sorry I doubted you. If anyone can do this, it's you." Jacqueline hugged her friend tightly. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I know," Tasha replied, "but you've always been the brave one." That night, Jacqueline couldn't sleep again, but for a different reason. As she reviewed her notes one last time, she found herself thinking about her grandmother. On a whim, she went to her closet and pulled out the old wooden chest. Inside, beneath family photos and birthday cards, Jacqueline found something unexpected. A thick folder marked Housing Law in her grandmother's neat handwriting. Inside were carefully organized notes, court case summaries, and newspaper clippings about tenant rights dating back 30 years. Jacqueline gasped as she flipped through the pages. It was as if her grandmother had prepared this specifically for her, though that was impossible. She had never told Grandma Eleanor about the problems with her apartment. At the back of the folder, Jacqueline found something that made her heart race. A court case almost identical to her situation, where tenants had won against a landlord trying to evict them to convert apartments into luxury units. The case had detailed notes in her grandmother's handwriting. "Thank you, Grandma," Jacqueline whispered to the empty room, clutching the folder to her chest. This was the secret weapon she needed. Now, standing in the courthouse hallway during the recess, Jacqueline touched the special folder hidden inside, her larger one. What Judge Maxwell didn't know, what no one knew, was that Jacqueline wasn't just fighting with her own research. She had generations of wisdom behind her. The bailiff appeared at the courtroom door. "Court will reconvene in 2 minutes." Jacqueline straightened her dress, gathered her courage, and walked back into the courtroom. Mr. Wilson and his lawyer were already seated, looking less confident than before. Judge Maxwell returned to his bench, his face now serious as he regarded Jacqueline. "Ms. Reynolds," the judge said, "please continue with your evidence." Jacqueline nodded and opened her folder. The real battle was about to begin. Judge Robert Maxwell had started that morning like any other. He woke up at 6:20 a.m. sharp in his king-size bed, in his large house, in the nicest part of town. His wife, Catherine, was already downstairs making coffee. She had been a lawyer before they had children, But now she organized charity events and sat on the boards of important organizations. As he adjusted his bow tie in the mirror, Judge Maxwell admired his reflection. 20 years on the bench had earned him respect and power. People stood when he entered rooms. Important people took his calls. His opinions mattered. Another day of maintaining order, he said to himself. This was how he saw his job, keeping the system running smoothly. He didn't have time for people who didn't understand how things worked. Over breakfast, Catherine reminded him about the dinner party they were hosting that weekend. The Wilsons and the Reeds will be there. Tom Reed said he has an easy case against some tenant today. He's representing James Wilson. Judge Maxwell nodded. He knew James Wilson. They belonged to the same golf club. Wilson owned several buildings downtown and was planning to develop luxury apartments. Good for the city's tax base, Maxwell thought. Apparently the tenant is representing herself, Catherine added, raising an eyebrow. Judge Maxwell chuckled. Those never go well. People watch too many legal dramas and think they can play lawyer. Now, sitting on the bench and watching Jacqueline Reynolds present actual evidence, Judge Maxwell felt uncomfortable. This wasn't going how he expected. He had 15 more cases to hear today, and he'd assumed this one would be quick and simple. Later, that evening, Judge Maxwell sat at his dining room table with 4 other judges and their wives. The conversation flowed along with expensive wine. The dinner had turned into an impromptu discussion about their most interesting cases. "You won't believe what I dealt with today," Maxwell said, cutting into his steak. A young teacher tried to fight her own eviction case. No lawyer, just a folder full of papers she probably printed from the internet. The other judges laughed, except for one, Judge William Washington, the oldest and most respected judge in the circuit. He watched Maxwell with wise eyes that had seen 50 years of law practice. "So what happened?" asked Judge Michaels, reaching for his wine. "We'll finish it tomorrow," Maxwell replied. "She actually came prepared with maintenance requests and photos, had me looking at dates and signatures." He shook his head. Wilson's lawyer wasn't ready for that. "Wilson? James Wilson?" asked Judge Thompson. "He's developing those new luxury units downtown, right? Good for the city." Judge Maxwell nodded. "The very same." "Well, I hope you don't let this teacher slow down progress," Thompson said. "The city needs those tax dollars." Maxwell smiled and nodded, but he noticed Judge Washington frowning slightly. "What about you, Bill?" Maxwell asked, trying to include the older judge. "Any interesting cases this week?" Judge Washington set down his fork carefully. "Nothing as interesting as yours, Robert. But I will say this. Don't underestimate people without law degrees. Sometimes they study harder than anyone because they have everything to lose." An awkward silence fell over the table. Judge Maxwell cleared his throat and quickly changed the subject to the upcoming judicial conference. Later, as the guests were leaving, Judge Washington pulled Maxwell aside. "That teacher's case. Keep an open mind, Robert." Maxwell forced a smile. "Of course. I always do." But as he closed the door behind his guests, Maxwell felt annoyed. He had already decided the teacher would lose her case. Wilson was an important businessman. The teacher was just a teacher. That's how the world worked. The next morning, Judge Maxwell drove his Mercedes to the courthouse. He parked in his reserved spot with his name on it. The security guards nodded respectfully as he passed through the metal detectors without being checked. The elevator operator held the door for him and took him directly to his floor. "Good morning, Your Honor," his clerk said, handing him a coffee just how he liked it. "What's on the docket today, Patricia?" he asked. "The Wilson eviction case is first," she replied. "The tenant, Ms. Reynolds, was here an hour early. She's waiting in the hallway with some witnesses." Judge Maxwell paused. Witnesses? That was unexpected. And Mr. Reed called. He said they may need more time than anticipated. Maxwell frowned. Tom Reed was one of the best property lawyers in the city. How could he need more time against a teacher with no legal experience? In his chambers, Judge Maxwell put on his black robe and looked in the mirror again. The robe always made him feel powerful, like he was above the ordinary problems of ordinary people. Today, though, he felt a flicker of unease. He remembered what Judge Washington had said the night before. Keep an open mind. But was that really necessary? He knew how these cases usually went. The landlord had the law on his side. The tenant was just delaying the inevitable. Still, as he prepared to enter the courtroom, Judge Maxwell found himself wondering about Jacqueline Reynolds. What made a history teacher think she could win against a professional lawyer? Why fight so hard for an apartment in an old building? He pushed these thoughts aside. It didn't matter. By the end of the day, Wilson would have his eviction order, and things would proceed as they always had. Judge Maxwell straightened his shoulders, nodded to the bailiff, and prepared to enter his courtroom. Meanwhile, in the D2 hallway outside, Jacqueline sat quietly with her elderly neighbors, Mrs. Garcia and Mr. Lee. They had agreed to testify about their own maintenance requests and the sudden eviction notices all tenants had received on the same day. "What if we lose?" Mrs. Garcia whispered nervously. Jacqueline squeezed her hand. "Then we lose together, fighting for what's right." Mr. Lee, who had lived in the building for 20 years, nodded firmly. "In all my years, no judge has ever heard my voice. Today, one will." The bailiff appeared at the courtroom door. All rise for the Honorable Judge Robert Maxwell. Jacqueline and her neighbors stood, gathering their courage. As they entered the courtroom, Jacqueline saw Mr. Wilson whispering to his lawyer. They both looked tense. Judge Maxwell took his seat and surveyed the room. His eyes narrowed slightly when he saw Jacqueline's witnesses. "We'll continue with Wilson Properties versus Jacqueline Reynolds," he announced. "Ms. Reynolds, I believe you were about to present additional evidence?" Jacqueline nodded and opened her folder. The real battle was about to begin. But what no one in the courtroom realized was that Judge Maxwell was facing a battle of his own. A battle between what he had always believed about the system and what was unfolding right in front of him. As Jacqueline began speaking, Judge Maxwell found himself actually listening. Something about her confidence made him curious. Maybe, just maybe, this case wouldn't be as straightforward as he had thought. The week after receiving her eviction notice had been the hardest for Jacqueline. She had spent that first night crying, feeling helpless and alone. But when morning came, she dried her tears and made a decision. She would not give up without a fight. After school that day, Jacqueline walked straight to the public library. It was an old brick building with big windows and quiet reading rooms. Jacqueline had always loved libraries. As a child, her grandmother would take her every Saturday to pick out books. "Ms. Reynolds, nice to see you," said Mrs. Chen, the head librarian. She was a small woman with gray-streaked hair and glasses on a chain around her neck. "How can I help you today?" "I need books on tenant rights and housing law," Jacqueline explained. "My landlord is trying to evict me, and I want to fight it." Mrs. Chen's eyes widened. "You're representing yourself?" Jacqueline nodded, feeling a little foolish under the librarian's surprised gaze. But instead of discouragement, Mrs. Chen gave her a determined smile. "Then we have work to do," she led Jacqueline to a section of thick, intimidating books with titles like State Housing Code and Property Law Fundamentals. Jacqueline's heart sank. How would she ever understand all this? "Start with this one," Mrs. Chen said, pulling out a simpler book called Tenant Rights: The Basics. It explains the concepts in plain language. Once you understand the basics, we can move to the more detailed texts. Jacqueline thanked her and found a quiet table by the window. She opened the book and began to read, taking careful notes in her spiral notebook. That first evening, Jacqueline stayed until the library closed at 9:00 p.m. Her head was spinning, with new terms like warranty of habitability and constructive eviction. Haiti, but something else was happening too. She was getting angry. According to what she was reading, many of Mr. Wilson's actions were clearly illegal. Every day after that, Jacqueline developed a routine. She would teach her history classes until 3:30 p.m., grade papers in her classroom until 5:00 p.m., then head to the library until closing time. On weekends, she arrived when the doors opened at 10 a.m. and stayed all day. By the second week, Mrs. Chen had shown Jacqueline how to use the library's legal database. Normally, only law students use this, she explained, but your case sounds important. The database was a treasure trove. Jacqueline could search for similar eviction cases and see how judges had ruled. She printed dozens of pages and organized them in a binder, using colored tabs to mark different sections. One evening, as Jacqueline Tates was deeply focused on her research, she didn't notice an older man watching her from a nearby table. He had white hair and wore a suit that looked expensive but not flashy. After a while, he approached her. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "I couldn't help noticing all the housing law materials you're reading." Jacqueline looked up, startled. She was used to being alone in this corner of the library. "Are you a law student?" the man asked. "No," Jacqueline replied. "I'm a teacher. I'm just trying to fight an eviction." The man nodded thoughtfully. "Representing yourself?" "Yes." To her surprise, he smiled. "Good for you. Most people don't bother to learn the law that affects their lives." Before walking away, he added, "When you present evidence in court, always start with your strongest points. Judges have limited attention spans." Jacqueline thanked him, wondering who he was. She never caught his name, but his advice stuck with her. The big breakthrough came during Jacqueline's third week of research. She was digging through case histories when she found something that made her heart race. A case from 10 years ago involving multiple tenants in a building owned by WP Development. WP? Wilson Properties, Jacqueline whispered to herself. She read further and discovered this was indeed one of Mr. Wilson's earlier buildings. He had tried to evict all tenants at once, claiming code violations and payment issues. But a group of tenants had fought back and won when they proved Wilson's real plan was to convert the building to luxury condos. The judge in that case had ruled that mass evictions based on false claims were a form of real estate fraud. The tenants had not only kept their homes, but had been awarded damages. Jacqueline printed the entire case file, her hands shaking with excitement. This could change everything. While the legal research was critical, Jacqueline also needed evidence from her own apartment. One Saturday, she took dozens of photos documenting every problem in her unit. The water damage, the cracked tiles, the leaky pipes. She also dug through her files and found every maintenance request she'd ever submitted, along with proof that Mr. Wilson had received them. She organized these by date and attached her photos. For the payment issues, Jacqueline printed her bank statements showing rent payments had been made on time. She highlighted each transaction and created a simple spreadsheet showing the date, amount, and confirmation number. Through her research, Jacqueline learned that recording conversations could be legal with one-party consent in her state. So when Mr. Wilson came to her door 2 weeks before the court date, demanding she leave the easy way, Jacqueline had her phone recording in her pocket. "Why are you doing this?" she had asked him. "I've always paid on time and taken care of my apartment." Wilson had laughed. "It's nothing personal. This building is worth triple once I renovate. These old units will be luxury apartments by next year." "But what about the people who live here?" Jacqueline had pressed. "These people won't know how to fight it legally," Wilson had said. "They'll move on, and that's business." Jacqueline had nearly gasped, but managed to keep her face neutral. She had him on record admitting the evictions were not about damages or late payments. They were about profit. That recording became her ace card, carefully saved on her phone, and backed up to her computer. The night before the court date, Jacqueline spread all her research materials across her small kitchen table. 3 thick binders contained everything she had learned: housing codes, similar cases, her own evidence, and witness statements from neighbors. She thought about how far she had come from that first night of tears. Even if she lost tomorrow, she wouldn't go down without making her voice heard. As she packed her materials for court, Jacqueline remembered something her grandmother used to say: "Knowledge isn't just power, it's dignity. No one can make you feel small when you know your worth." Tomorrow, she would show Judge Maxwell and Mr. Wilson exactly what she was worth. Back in the courtroom, Jacqueline presented her maintenance requests and payment records. Judge Maxwell was reviewing them carefully, his earlier dismissive attitude replaced with grudging attention. "Your Honor," Jacqueline said, "I'd like to call my first witness, Mrs. Elena Garcia, who has lived in the building for 15 years and received an identical eviction notice the same day I did." As Mrs. Garcia was sworn in, Jacqueline noticed Mr. Wilson shifting uncomfortably in his seat. His lawyer whispered something urgently in his ear. Jacqueline smiled slightly. She hadn't even shown them her strongest evidence yet. The day was just beginning, and already the balance of power was shifting in the courtroom. Mrs. Garcia sat nervously in the witness chair. She was a small woman with silver-streaked black hair tied back in a bun. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her purse. "Mrs. Garcia," Jacqueline began gently, "how long have you lived in the building?" 15 years, Mrs. Garcia replied. "I raised my children there." "And have you had maintenance issues similar to the ones I showed in my apartment?" Mrs. Garcia nodded. "Yes, my ceiling leaks too. The super stopped coming to fix things about 2 years ago." Jacqueline walked closer. "And when did you receive your eviction notice?" "Same day as you. All of us got them the same day." Jacqueline turned to Judge Maxwell. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence these maintenance requests from 5 different tenants in the building, all with similar issues, all ignored by Mr. Wilson." Judge Maxwell accepted the folder Jacqueline handed him. He flipped through the pages with a frown. "Mr. Reed, did your client respond to these maintenance requests?" Mr. Wilson's lawyer stood up quickly. "Your Honor, we're not aware of receiving all of these. The building manager may have—" "The building manager works for your client," Judge Maxwell interrupted. "Mr. Wilson is responsible for his employees' actions." Jacqueline felt a small thrill. The judge was actually holding Wilson accountable. After Mrs. Garcia, Jacqueline called Mr. Lee to testify. He was 83 years old and had lived in the building for 20 years. "Mr. Lee, what happened when you tried to get repairs done in your apartment?" Jacqueline asked. Mr. Lee straightened in his chair. "They always say, 'Next week, next week.' I show them the water coming through my bathroom ceiling. They say next week. That was 2 years ago." When Mr. Lee finished, Judge Maxwell asked him a question directly. "Sir, were you ever late with your rent payments?" "Never," Mr. Lee said firmly. "My Social Security comes on the 1st. I pay rent on the 2nd. Every month for 20 years. Judge Maxwell nodded and made a note. It was Mr. Wilson's lawyer's turn to question the witnesses. He tried to suggest, That maybe they hadn't submitted their maintenance requests properly, or that the problems weren't as bad as they claimed. "Mrs. Garcia," he asked, "isn't it possible that your children caused some of the damage in your apartment?" Mrs. Garcia sat up straighter. "My children are grown. They moved out years ago. The water comes from the roof, not from my family." The lawyer looked frustrated. He tried again with Mr. Lee. "Mr. Lee, at your age, perhaps you're confused about when you submitted these requests?" Jacqueline stood up immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. That question is disrespectful to Mr. Lee's mental capacity." To her surprise, Judge Maxwell nodded. "Sustained. Mr. Reed, please refrain from making assumptions about the witness's mental state based on his age." Mr. Reed's face reddened. "No further questions," he muttered. "Let's take a 15-minute recess," Judge Maxwell announced. "When we return, Ms. Reynolds can present her final evidence." As people stood up, Jacqueline saw Mr. Wilson grab his lawyer's arm. They were arguing in hushed voices. Meanwhile, Judge Maxwell was watching Jacqueline with a puzzled expression, like he couldn't quite figure her out. During the break, Jacqueline stayed in the courtroom reviewing her notes. She was about to present her strongest evidence, the recording and the case she'd found from 10 years ago. Her heart was racing, but she felt ready. When court resumed, Judge Maxwell seemed different. He was sitting up straighter and watching everything more carefully. "Ms. Reynolds, please proceed with your final evidence," he said. Jacqueline stood up confidently. "Your Honor, my next piece of evidence is a court case from 10 years ago, Wilson Properties versus tenants of Maple Street Apartments." Mr. Reed jumped to his feet. "Objection. Previous cases are irrelevant to this proceeding." "Your Honor," Jacqueline countered, "this case is directly relevant because it involved the same landlord using the same tactics, filing mass evictions based on false claims to clear a building for luxury development." Judge Maxwell raised his eyebrows. "I'll allow it. Continue, Ms. Reynolds." Jacqueline handed copies of the case to the judge and to Mr. Reed. In this case, the court found that Mr. Wilson had filed fraudulent eviction notices against all tenants, simultaneously to clear the building for renovation. The judge ruled this was an abuse of the eviction process and ordered Mr. Wilson to pay damages. Judge Maxwell studied the documents carefully. "This is interesting. The ruling does seem applicable." Mr. Wilson was whispering frantically to his lawyer now. Jacqueline continued, "Just like in that case, every tenant in our building received identical eviction notices on the same day. And just like in that case, the real reason wasn't property damage or late payments." She paused, then delivered her bombshell. "Your Honor, I have proof of Mr. Wilson's true motives." Jacqueline took out her phone. "2 weeks ago, Mr. Wilson came to my apartment. With his permission to enter, I legally recorded our conversation according to the one-party consent law in our state. I'd like to play this recording for the court." Judge Maxwell looked surprised but nodded. "Proceed." Jacqueline played the recording. Mr. Wilson's voice filled the courtroom. "These old units will be luxury apartments by next year. These people won't know how to fight it legally. They'll move on, and that's business." The courtroom was completely silent when the recording ended. Mr. Wilson's face had turned a deep shade of red. His lawyer looked stunned. Judge Maxwell removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. When he looked up, his expression had completely changed. He was looking at Jacqueline with what appeared to be respect. "Mr. Reed," the judge said, "would you like to respond to this evidence?" The lawyer stood up, clearly flustered. "Your Honor, my client was speaking hypothetically, and regardless of future plans for the building, There are still legitimate grounds for eviction based on what? Judge Maxwell interrupted. The maintenance issues that your client ignored, the late payments that bank records prove, never happened? Or perhaps you're referring to the identical eviction notices that miraculously appeared for all tenants on the same day? Mr. Reed opened and closed his mouth without speaking. Mr. Wilson tugged at his collar. Judge Maxwell turned to Jacqueline. Ms. Reynolds, is there anything else you'd like to add before I make my ruling? Jacqueline took a deep breath. Just this, Your Honor. The law exists to protect everyone, not just those who can afford expensive lawyers. My neighbors and I work hard. We pay our rent. We deserve safe, maintained homes and fair treatment under the law. She sat down, her heart pounding. She had done everything she could. Now it was up to the judge. Judge Maxwell was silent for a long moment. The entire courtroom held its breath. Finally, he spoke. This court will take a 30-minute recess while I review all the evidence. When we return, I'll have my decision. As people stood, Jacqueline saw something she didn't expect. Judge Maxwell was looking directly at her, and he gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. Maybe, just maybe, justice would prevail today. During the 30-minute recess, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Mr. Wilson and his lawyer huddled in the corner, their faces grim. Jacqueline sat quietly, reviewing her notes one more time. Mrs. Garcia and Mr. Lee stayed nearby, offering silent support. Jacqueline's mind drifted back to the night before, when she had made her final preparation. After finding her grandmother's folder marked Housing Law, she had stayed up past midnight studying the notes. One detail had jumped out, a reference to a legal principle called pattern and practice of discrimination. Her grandmother's neat handwriting had explained, when a landlord treats all tenants of a certain type the same way, it can show discrimination. Jacqueline had wondered what her grandmother meant by a certain type. Then she looked at her. Buildings tenants, mostly older people, immigrants, teachers, nurses, working people with modest incomes. While waiting for the judge to return, Jacqueline opened the special folder she had kept hidden until now. Inside was her grandmother's carefully organized research, including the case from 10 years ago, with additional notes her grandmother had made. There were also newspaper clippings about other Wilson Properties developments where tenants had been forced out. Jacqueline had already presented the case itself as evidence, but she hadn't yet revealed that her grandmother had been tracking Mr. Wilson's business practices for years. The notes showed a clear pattern. Buy old buildings, force tenants out through neglect and false evictions, then renovate for wealthy new tenants. The bailiff's voice interrupted her thoughts. All rise for the Honorable Judge Robert Maxwell. Judge walked in looking serious. His eyes briefly met Jacqueline's before he sat down. Before I render my decision, Judge Maxwell said, I'd like to address a few more questions to both parties. He turned to Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson, please take the stand. Mr. Wilson looked surprised, but complied. After being sworn in, he sat stiffly in the witness chair. Judge Maxwell regarded him calmly. Mr. Wilson, the recording we heard suggests you planned these evictions to clear the building for luxury renovations. Is that accurate? Wilson shifted uncomfortably. Your Honor, business plans change all the time. I may have mentioned potential future renovations, but the evictions are based on legitimate issues. I see, said Judge Maxwell. And is it just coincidence that every tenant received an identical eviction notice on the same day? We had a building inspection that day, Wilson stammered. The inspector found multiple violations. Jacqueline stood up. Your Honor, may I present one final piece of evidence? The judge nodded. Proceed, Ms. Reynolds. This was it, the moment to reveal her true secret weapon. Jacqueline walked forward with the folder she had kept separate from her other evidence. Your Honor, I've discovered that Mr. Wilson has a long history of using this exact same tactic with other properties. She handed the folder to Judge Maxwell. These are newspaper articles, tenant complaints, and court records showing that Wilson Properties has done this at least 5 times in the past 15 years. Buying buildings occupied by lower-income tenants, neglecting repairs, filing mass evictions based on false claims, then converting to luxury units. Objection! Mr. Reed shouted. This is irrelevant and prejudicial. Judge Maxwell held up his hand. I'll decide what's relevant, Counselor. He opened the folder and began reading. His eyebrows rose as he turned the pages. Ms. Reynolds, did you obtain these records? The judge asked. Jacqueline took a deep breath. They were collected by my grandmother, Eleanor Reynolds. She worked as a legal secretary for 40 years before she passed away. She kept detailed records of housing cases she thought were important. The courtroom was silent as Judge Maxwell continued reading. After several minutes, he looked up. Mr. Wilson, these records suggest a consistent pattern of behavior across multiple properties. Would you care to explain? Wilson's face had gone pale. Your Honor, real estate development always involves tenant turnover. There's nothing illegal about improving properties. Improvement isn't the issue, Judge Maxwell replied. Fabricating reasons for eviction is the issue, and based on the evidence I've seen today, that appears to be exactly what you've done. Jacqueline watched as Mr. Wilson's confident facade crumbled. His lawyer was frantically writing notes. Judge Maxwell handed the folder back to Jacqueline and addressed the courtroom. I've reviewed all the evidence presented today, and I'm ready to make my ruling. Jacqueline held her breath. Mrs. Garcia gripped her hand tightly. In the case of Wilson Properties versus Jacqueline Reynolds, I find in favor of Ms. Reynolds. A small gasp went through the courtroom. Jacqueline felt tears spring to her eyes. Furthermore, Judge Maxwell continued, I am dismissing all eviction proceedings against tenants in the building at 1420 Maple Street. Mr. Wilson, you are ordered to make all necessary repairs to bring the building up to code within 30 days. Rent cannot be increased for any current tenant for a period of 1 year. Judge Maxwell wasn't finished. Additionally, I am referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for review of potential real estate fraud charges based on the pattern of behavior documented in Ms. Reynolds' evidence. Mr. Wilson jumped to his feet. You can't do that. I'll appeal. You're welcome to try, Judge Maxwell replied calmly, but I suggest you focus on fixing those apartments first. He banged his gavel. Court is adjourned. Jacqueline sat stunned as people began moving around her. Mrs. Garcia was crying with joy. Mr. Lee patted her shoulder with a trembling hand. We won, Jacqueline whispered, hardly believing it. We actually won. Her neighbors surrounded her, thanking her through tears and hugs. Even a few strangers who had been watching the case came up to congratulate her. As the courtroom emptied, Jacqueline noticed Judge Maxwell watching her from his bench. He gestured for her to approach. Ms. Reynolds, he said quietly when everyone else had left. That was quite impressive. Thank you, Your Honor, Jacqueline replied. I owe you an apology, Judge Maxwell said, his voice low. When you first stood up in my courtroom, I made assumptions I shouldn't have made. I didn't think you could possibly know enough law to win. This case? Jacqueline nodded, surprised by his honesty. If you don't mind me asking, the judge continued, where did you learn to prepare a case so well? Jacqueline smiled. thinking of the late nights in the library, her grandmother's notes, and her own determination. "I had a good teacher," she said simply. As she turned to leave, Jacqueline felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The fight wasn't completely over. Mr. Wilson might still appeal, and the repairs would need to be monitored. But today, at least, justice had prevailed. And the biggest surprise wasn't that she had won. It was that she had discovered something about herself in the process. Something that felt a lot like her true calling. Jacqueline walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sunlight. Her mind was still trying to process everything that had happened. She had stood up against Mr. Wilson and his expensive lawyer, and she had won. Mrs. Garcia hugged her tightly. "You saved our homes, Jacqueline. How can we ever thank you?" "You don't need to thank me," Jacqueline said. "We fought this together." Mr. Lee nodded, his eyes bright with tears. "We will celebrate tonight. My wife is making her famous dumplings. You must come." Jacqueline promised she would. As her neighbors headed home to spread the good news, Jacqueline sat down on a bench outside the courthouse. She needed a moment to catch her breath. She pulled out her phone to call Tasha. Her friend screamed with joy when Jacqueline told her the news. "I knew you could do it," Tasha exclaimed. "Well, honestly, I didn't know, but I hoped you could," Jacqueline laughed. "I can hardly believe it myself." "So what happens now?" Tasha asked. "Wilson has to fix everything in 30 days, and he can't raise our rent for a year." Jacqueline's voice grew serious. The judge also referred the case to the district attorney. Wilson might face fraud charges. "Serves him right," Tasha said firmly. "Are you coming home now?" "In a little while," Jacqueline replied. "I need some time to think." After they hung up, Jacqueline sat quietly, watching people come and go from the courthouse. Some looked happy, others sad or worried. She wondered about their stories, their fights for justice. The courthouse doors opened, and Judge Maxwell emerged. He had changed out of his black robe and was wearing a gray suit. He spotted Jacqueline on the bench and hesitated before walking over. "Mind if I join you for a moment?" he asked. Jacqueline nodded, surprised. Judge Maxwell sat down, leaving space between them. "I want you to know that your case has made me think about how I do my job." Jacqueline listened quietly. "When you first stood up in my courtroom," he continued, "I didn't give you a fair chance. I saw someone without a law degree and assumed you couldn't possibly understand the law." "Many people made that assumption," Jacqueline said. The judge nodded. "I've been on the bench for 20 years. Sometimes I forget why I became a judge in the first place. To ensure everyone gets fair treatment under the law, not just those who can afford expensive lawyers." Jacqueline thought about this. The law is complicated, but it shouldn't be impossible for regular people to understand. "You're right," Judge Maxwell agreed. "That's why I've decided to start a program at the courthouse. Plain language guides to help people who represent themselves. Would you be willing to review some materials once we create them? Your perspective would be valuable." Jacqueline was stunned by the request. "I'd be honored." Judge Maxwell stood to leave. "One more thing, Ms. Reynolds. Have you ever considered law school?" The question caught Jacqueline off guard. "I'm a teacher," she said automatically. "You'd make an excellent lawyer," the judge replied. "Something to think about." With a nod, he walked away. Jacqueline watched him go, his words echoing in her mind. Law school? Her? It seemed impossible. And yet, after today, she was starting to believe that impossible things could happen. When Jacqueline returned to her apartment building, she found a small celebration happening in the courtyard. Someone had set up a folding table with cookies and lemonade. Neighbors who had never spoken before were talking and laughing together. "There she is," called Mrs. Garcia. "Our champion." Jacqueline blushed as people clapped. "I'm no champion," she protested. "I just did what anyone would do." "But that's just it," said Mr. Patel, who lived on the first floor. "Not anyone would do it. You fought when the rest of us were ready to give up." As Jacqueline talked with her neighbors, she learned that many of them had lived with broken appliances, leaky ceilings, and other problems for years without complaining. They had been afraid of being evicted if they spoke up. "Things will be different now," Jacqueline promised. "We'll form a tenants association to make sure Wilson keeps his word about the repairs." By the time Jacqueline finally made it to her apartment, she was exhausted but happy. She kicked off her shoes and collapsed on her couch. On her coffee table sat the folder of her grandmother's research, the secret weapon that had helped her. When Jacqueline opened it again, looking more carefully at her grandmother's notes, she noticed something she had missed before. Little comments in the margins about helping tenants prepare their cases. Had her grandmother been quietly assisting people with housing problems all those years? It would explain her detailed knowledge of housing law. "I wish you were here," Jacqueline whispered. "I have so many questions for you now." She gently closed the folder and placed it on her bookshelf. Tomorrow, she would start organizing the Tenants Association. She also needed to prepare for her classes. Her students would want to hear all about the court case. As Jacqueline got ready for bed, her phone rang. It was a local news reporter who had been in the courtroom. "Ms. Reynolds, would you be willing to do an interview about your case? It could help other tenants facing similar situations." Jacqueline hesitated. She wasn't comfortable with the tension, but the reporter had a point. Her story might help others. "Yes," she decided. "I'll do it." After scheduling the interview for the next day, Jacqueline finally lay down in bed. Through her window, she could see stars in the night sky. She thought about Judge Maxwell's question about law school, about her grandmother's secret legal work, about the neighbors who were counting on her. Maybe teaching wasn't her only calling after all. Maybe she could do both. Teach during the day and help people with housing problems in her spare time. Or maybe someday she could even become a lawyer who specialized in tenant rights. For the first time in weeks, Jacqueline fell asleep quickly, without worrying about losing her home. And as she slept, she dreamed of courtrooms and classrooms, of helping people find their voices and stand up for their rights. The battle with Mr. Wilson had ended with a victory. But something told Jacqueline that her journey was just beginning. News of Jacqueline's victory spread quickly through the apartment building. By the next morning, a handmade sign hung in the lobby. "Tenant meeting, 7 p.m. tonight." Mrs. Garcia had organized it, insisting that they needed to strike while the iron is hot. At school, Jacqueline tried to focus on teaching her history class about the civil rights movement, but her students seemed distracted. "Ms. Reynolds," Jamal asked, raising his hand, "is it true you beat a rich landlord in court yesterday?" Jacqueline was startled. "How did you know about that?" "It's all over social media," Elena explained, holding up her phone. "Someone recorded you leaving the courthouse. They called you the teacher who taught her landlord a lesson." Jacqueline hadn't expected this attention. "Yes, I represented myself in an eviction case," she admitted. "But I'm not sure it's relevant to today's lesson." "But it is," Jamal insisted. "We're learning about people standing up for their rights. That's exactly what you did." The other students nodded eagerly. Jacqueline saw their excitement and decided to use it as a teaching moment. "Okay," she said, putting down her lesson plan. "Let's talk about how ordinary people can use the legal system to protect their rights." For the rest of the class, Jacqueline explained how she had researched housing law, gathered evidence, and prepared her case. Her students asked thoughtful questions about the legal process. "I never thought regular people could win against powerful people in court," said Elena. "You've changed how I see the law, Ms. Reynolds." Jacqueline smiled, touched by her words. "The law belongs to all of us, not just to those who can afford expensive lawyers." After school, Tasha picked Jacqueline up for the news interview. "I still can't believe you're going to be on TV," Tasha said, as they drove downtown. "It's just the local news," Jacqueline replied. "And I'm only doing it to help other people in similar situations." The interview took place in the station's small studio. Jacqueline felt nervous under the bright lights, but the reporter asked straightforward questions about her case and how she had prepared for it. "What advice would you give to others facing unfair evictions?" the reporter asked finally. Jacqueline thought carefully before answering. "Learn your rights. Document everything. And don't be intimidated by fancy lawyers or important people. The law is meant to protect everyone, not just the wealthy and powerful." When the interview aired that evening, Jacqueline watched it with her neighbors in Mr. Lee's apartment. They cheered and clapped when she spoke about forming a tenants association. "You're a natural on camera," Mrs. Garcia said. "You should have your own legal advice show." Jacqueline laughed, but the seed of an idea had been planted. Maybe there were ways she could help more people understand their rights. After the tenant meeting, where they organized committees to monitor the repairs and research tenant rights, Jacqueline checked her email. She was surprised to find dozens of messages from strangers asking for advice about their own housing problems. One message particularly caught her attention. It was from a community college teacher named David Ortiz. "I run a free legal clinic for low-income residents. Would you be willing to speak to our volunteers about your experience? Your approach could help many others." Jacqueline replied immediately, agreeing to speak at the clinic. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Wilson Properties sent contractors to begin repairs on the building. Jacqueline helped organize the tenants to document all the work and ensure nothing was skipped. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about her case, focusing on how she had uncovered Wilson's pattern of pushing out lower-income tenants. When Jacqueline spoke at the legal clinic, the room was packed. People stood along the walls and sat on the floor to hear her story. She had prepared a simple handout explaining the basic steps she had followed. "You don't need a law degree to understand your rights," Jacqueline told them. "You just need determination and good resources." After her talk, David Ortiz offered her a volunteer position advising tenants one evening a week. "We need someone who can explain legal concepts in plain language," he said. "You have a gift for that." Jacqueline accepted, even though it meant less free time. Something about helping others with their housing problems felt right. Meanwhile, at school, her principal had noticed the positive attention Jacqueline was receiving. "Your students' parents are impressed," she told Jacqueline. "They're saying, you've inspired their children to be more interested in civics and law." The principal suggested Jacqueline develop a special unit on practical law for everyday life. "These kids need to know their rights as citizens," she said. "Who better to teach them than someone who's put those rights into action?" Jacqueline threw herself into creating the new curriculum. She designed lessons about housing rights, consumer protection, and civil liberties, all explained in language teenagers could understand. One afternoon, Jacqueline received a surprising visitor. At school, Judge Washington, the older judge who had warned Judge Maxwell not to underestimate her, appeared at her classroom door after the students had left. "Ms. Reynolds," he said with a warm smile, "I've been following your story with great interest." "You have?" Jacqueline asked, surprised. "Indeed. It's not every day that a self-represented litigant wins so thoroughly against an established property company." He paused. "I understand you met a helpful stranger at the library while doing your research. Jacqueline looked at him more carefully. "That was you?" Judge Washington nodded. "I recognized your determination. It reminded me of myself many years ago." He told Jacqueline about his own journey from public housing to law school to the bench. "The law needs more people like you," he said. "People who understand what it means to fight for justice from the bottom." As he was leaving, Judge Washington handed Jacqueline his card. "If you ever decide to pursue legal education, please contact me. I mentor promising students, particularly those from non-traditional backgrounds." Jacqueline thanked him, adding his card to a growing collection of contacts she had made since the trial. Her world was expanding in ways she had never imagined. That evening, as Jacqueline helped a nervous young couple prepare for their own housing hearing at the legal clinic, she realized how much her life had changed in just a few weeks. She was still a teacher, but now she was teaching beyond her classroom walls. "You're going to be fine," she assured the couple. "Just stick to the facts and know your rights." They looked at her with the same hope she had seen in her neighbor's eyes. Jacqueline understood now that her victory wasn't just about saving her apartment. It was about showing others that they could fight back, too. 3 months after the trial, Jacqueline's life had found a new rhythm. During the day, she taught history at Lincoln High. 2 evenings a week, she volunteered at the legal clinic. On weekends, she helped with the tenant association meetings in her building. The repairs to her apartment were finally complete. No more leaky ceiling, no more cracked tiles. Mr. Wilson had kept his distance, leaving the work to his contractors. The tenants made sure every repair was done properly, taking photos and keeping detailed records. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Jacqueline checked her mailbox after school and found an official-looking envelope. The return address said Martinson Foundation for Legal Education. Curious, she opened it while walking up the stairs to her apartment. Inside was a letter that made her stop in her tracks. "Dear Ms. Reynolds, we are pleased to invite you to apply for the Martinson Foundation's Special Legal Education Program. This program is designed for individuals without formal legal training, who have demonstrated exceptional legal aptitude and commitment to justice. The program provides a full scholarship to law school while allowing participants to continue working part-time in their current fields. Only 10 candidates are selected each year from across the country. Your recent housing case has come to our attention, and we believe you would be an ideal candidate for our program. Please contact us at your earliest convenience to discuss this opportunity." Jacqueline read the letter 3 times, hardly believing what she was seeing. A full scholarship to law school? Her? She had never seriously considered becoming a lawyer. She loved teaching. But then again, these past 3 months had awakened something new in her, a passion for helping people navigate the legal system. She called the number on the letter with shaking hands. The woman who answered explained that someone had nominated Jacqueline for the program based on her performance in court and her subsequent community work. "Who nominated me?" Jacqueline asked. "The foundation keeps nominations confidential," the woman replied, "but I can tell you it was someone with significant standing in the legal community who was extremely impressed by your work." After the call, Jacqueline sat on her couch, staring at the letter. This was a life-changing opportunity. She could become a lawyer without giving up teaching entirely. She could help even more people stand up for their rights. But was it what she really wanted? Jacqueline had never planned to leave teaching. She loved working with her students, seeing their eyes light up when they understood something new. She called Tasha for advice. "Are you kidding me?" Tasha exclaimed when Jacqueline explained the situation. "This is amazing. You have to apply." "But I love teaching," Jacqueline said. "I never thought about being anything else." "You can do both," Tasha pointed out. "That's what makes this program perfect for you. Plus, Think of all the people you could help with a law degree. Jacqueline promised to think about it. That night, she pulled out her grandmother's folder again, looking for guidance in the carefully organized notes. As she flipped through the pages, she noticed a small envelope she hadn't seen before, tucked into a pocket at the back of the folder. It was addressed simply, "For Jacqueline, when she finds her path." Jacqueline's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a note in her grandmother's handwriting. "My dearest Jacqueline, if you're reading this, it means you've discovered the power of standing up for what's right. I always knew you had it in you. Your kind heart and sharp mind are a powerful combination. For 40 years, I worked as a legal secretary at Henderson and Wright. While I didn't have a law degree, I learned everything I could. I used that knowledge to help people in our community who couldn't afford lawyers. I collected these materials hoping they might be useful to you someday. Whether you're fighting your own battle or helping others fight theirs, remember that justice is for everyone, not just those who can pay for it. Whatever path you choose, I am so proud of you. All my love, Grandma Eleanor." Tears streamed down Jacqueline's face as she read the note. Her grandmother had been a secret legal advocate, just as Jacqueline had suspected. And somehow, Eleanor had known that Jacqueline might follow in her footsteps one day. The next morning, Jacqueline was still thinking about her grandmother's letter when her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. "Is this Jacqueline Reynolds?" asked a deep, gentle voice. "Yes, it is." "This is Judge William Washington. I hope I'm not disturbing." "You!" Jacqueline's heart skipped a beat. The older judge who had spoken to her at school was calling her directly. "Not at all, Your Honor. How can I help you?" "I wanted to check if you received a letter from the Martinson Foundation." Jacqueline gasped. "It was you? You nominated me?" "Sir, Judge chuckled. "I've been watching your case with interest from the beginning. When I saw you in the library that day, I recognized something special. The same determination I had when I was starting out." "I don't know what to say," Jacqueline replied. "It's an incredible opportunity, but I never thought about becoming a lawyer." "May I tell you a story?" Judge Washington asked. He explained that he had grown up in public housing, raised by a single mother who worked as a janitor in the courthouse. He would wait for her after school, sitting in courtrooms, watching proceedings. "Saw how people without lawyers were treated," he said. "I decided then that I would become a lawyer who understood what it meant to fight from the bottom. The law needs people like you, Ms. Reynolds, people with real-world experience who can make the system work for everyone." After talking with Judge Washington, Jacqueline felt a sense of clarity. She asked if they could meet in person to discuss the program further. The judge suggested they meet at the courthouse. When Jacqueline arrived, Judge Washington was waiting in the lobby. He led her to his chambers, a warm room with walls lined with law books and framed photographs. "I have something to show you," he said, pointing to a photo of a much younger version of himself standing with a group of people. "This was taken after my first major housing case. We saved 30 families from eviction." Jacqueline looked more closely at the photo. In the back row, almost hidden, was a familiar face. Her grandmother, Eleanor Reynolds. "You knew my grandmother?" Jacqueline gasped. Judge Washington smiled warmly. "Eleanor was the best legal secretary I ever worked with. She taught me as much as any law professor. She helped with that housing case, did most of the research, actually." Jacqueline was stunned. "But the law firm she worked for, Henderson and Wright, yes. I worked there before becoming a judge," Washington explained. "Your grandmother had a brilliant legal mind. She would have made an outstanding lawyer if she'd had the opportunities available today. Everything was falling into place. Her grandmother's detailed notes, her knowledge of housing law, her secret assistance to tenants. It was all connected to her work with Judge Washington. "She never told me," Jacqueline said softly. "Eleanor was humble about her contributions," Washington replied, "but she changed many lives, just as you're doing now." As they talked more about the scholarship program, Jacqueline felt her grandmother's presence guiding her. Perhaps this had been Eleanor's plan all along, to pass the torch to Jacqueline, to give her the opportunity she never had herself. When Jacqueline left the courthouse that afternoon, her path was clear. She would apply for the Martinson program. She would become a lawyer, like Judge Washington, like her grandmother should have been, and she would make them both proud. 1 year later, Jacqueline stood at the front of her classroom at Lincoln High School. Sunlight streamed through the windows as her students worked on a special project about housing rights. On the wall behind her desk hung a framed newspaper article with the headline, "Teacher Wins Landmark Housing Case." "5 more minutes," Jacqueline told her students, "then we'll hear your presentations." So much had changed in a year. Jacqueline was now in her 2nd semester of law school, attending evening classes 3 nights a week while continuing to teach during the day. The Martinson Scholarship covered all her expenses, making the seemingly impossible dream possible. Her apartment building had transformed too. With the repairs completed, the place looked better than it had in years. The tenant association, Jacqueline had helped form, was still going strong, meeting monthly to address any new issues. Mr. Wilson had sold the building to a nonprofit housing organization, wanting to distance himself from the bad publicity of the case. As Jacqueline watched her students work, she thought about how her legal education was already helping her become a better teacher. She had created a new unit called Practical Law for Young Citizens that taught teenagers about their rights in everyday situations. The curriculum had become so popular that other schools in the district were adopting it. "Time's up," Jacqueline announced. "Who wants to present first?" Jamal raised his hand eagerly. His group had researched tenant rights for people under 21. As he explained what they had learned, Jacqueline felt a surge of pride. These students were learning lessons it had taken her years to discover. After school, Jacqueline headed to the community center downtown. Today was special, the opening of the new free legal advice clinic that she had helped establish with funding from a local foundation. What had started as a small volunteer operation had grown into something much bigger. The clinic occupied a bright, welcoming space with several private consultation rooms. Volunteer lawyers and law students would provide advice 3 days a week on housing issues, consumer rights, and family law. Jacqueline would work there on Saturdays, focusing on tenant-landlord disputes. Judge Maxwell was waiting outside when she arrived. After her case, he had become a surprising ally, using his influence to support the clinic and Jacqueline's scholarship application. "Ready for the ribbon cutting?" he asked with a smile. Jacqueline nodded, still amazed by how their relationship had evolved from that first day in court when he had laughed at her. Inside, the room was filling with people. Judge Washington stood chatting with Tasha, who had volunteered to handle the clinic's social media. Mrs. Garcia and Mr. Lee had brought homemade cookies for the occasion. David Ortiz from the community college was setting up an information table. At exactly 4:00 p.m., Jacqueline stepped forward to address the crowd. Public speaking had become easier with practice, though she still felt butterflies in her stomach. "Welcome to the Community Justice Legal Clinic," she began. "A year ago, I stood in a courtroom feeling alone and overwhelmed. I didn't know if I could possibly win against a system that seemed designed for people with money and power." She paused, looking at the familiar and new faces watching her. "What I learned through that experience changed my life. I discovered that the law belongs to all of us, not just to those who can afford expensive lawyers. I discovered that knowledge truly is power. And I discovered that when we help others understand their rights, we create stronger communities. Judge Washington nodded approvingly as Jacqueline continued. This clinic is dedicated to my grandmother, Eleanor Reynolds, who spent her life quietly helping others navigate the legal system. Her example taught me that you don't need a fancy title to make a difference. You just need determination and compassion. Jacqueline gestured to a small plaque on the wall bearing her grandmother's name. Eleanor believed that education is the one thing no one can take from you. In that spirit, this clinic will not only provide legal advice, but will teach people how to advocate for themselves. After cutting the ribbon to enthusiastic applause, Jacqueline spent the next hour showing visitors around the clinic. A local reporter interviewed her about the connection between teaching and legal advocacy. They're not as different as they might seem, Jacqueline explained. Both are about empowering people with knowledge. As the event wound down, Tasha pulled Jacqueline aside. I have something to show you. She led Jacqueline to her car and opened the trunk. Inside was a beautiful wooden sign that read, "The Eleanor Reynolds Community Justice Clinic." It's for the outside of the building, Tasha explained. We all chipped in, the tenants, your students, the volunteers. Jacqueline's eyes filled with tears. It's perfect, she whispered, tracing her grandmother's name with her finger. That evening, after everyone had gone, Jacqueline sat alone in the clinic. On her desk was a framed photo of her grandmother and a copy of the housing law notes that had helped her win her case. Next to these was her law school textbook, open to a chapter on housing discrimination. Her phone buzzed with a message from Judge Washington. Eleanor would be so proud of what you've created today. This is just the beginning. Jacqueline smiled, knowing he was right. This was just the beginning. Next semester, she would start a program to train high school students as community legal advocates. She was already planning summer workshops for tenants facing eviction. And in 3 years, when she passed the bar exam, she would open her own practice focusing on housing justice. As Jacqueline locked up the clinic and stepped out into the evening, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. It had started with one unfair eviction notice and had grown into something she could never have imagined. In her classroom, the next day, Jacqueline wrote her grandmother's saying on the board, "Education is the one thing no one can take from you." A student raised her hand. "Ms. Reynolds, is it true that you're becoming a lawyer because you fought your own case?" "That's part of it," Jacqueline replied. "But the bigger truth is that I'm becoming a lawyer because I discovered that's who I was meant to be all along." Sometimes life's biggest challenges reveal our true purpose. She looked out at the young faces watching her intently. Each of you has gifts that are waiting to be discovered. Each of you has the power to stand up for what's right. And each of you can make a difference in ways you might not even imagine yet. As Jacqueline began her lesson, she felt a sense of perfect balance. Teacher and student, advocate and mentor, carrying forward a legacy while creating her own. The courtroom where Judge Maxwell had once laughed at her now seemed like a distant memory, just one step on a much longer journey. Jacqueline Reynolds, teacher and future lawyer, had found her true calling, and somewhere, she was certain, her grandmother was smiling. Thanks for joining us for this inspiring story of Jacqueline Reynolds' triumph in court. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so drop your location in the comments below. If this story of determination and justice touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We share powerful stories like Jacqueline's every week that will move and inspire you. Remember, whether you're facing your own challenges or supporting someone else through theirs, A little kindness goes a long way. Share this video with someone who needs encouragement today. Until fin. Next time, keep standing up for what's right.